so lucky to have our next speaker, who is a seasoned theologian and who, in particular, can give us deep theological answers that undergird whatever we believe and do for Israel. He is a recently retired Anglican Chair of Divinity in Sanford Beeson Divinity School in the United States, which followed 26 years of teaching undergraduates at Roanoke College in Virginia. He's authored and edited numerous books. One stands out to me. It's called The New Christian Zionism. I recommend that along with other books like Israel Matters. And please listen carefully, because this will be really good stuff. Let me welcome Dr. Gerald McDermott.
Thank you, Mojmir and Jürgen Buehler and David Parsons. God's doing great things through ICEJ. I'm very privileged to speak here. Jürgen asked me to give a talk on new perspectives on Paul and Israel. You know, the Apostle Paul is not always easy to understand. Hi, Martha. His writings have confused many. Even his fellow apostle, St. Peter, wrote in 2 Peter 3 that Paul is sometimes hard to understand. And the ignorant and the unstable twist his words to their own destruction, Peter writes. 2,000 years later, there still is much uncertainty about Paul. The Catholic philosopher Robert Royle, for example, recently confessed it was many years before he came to fathom St. Paul's mania. Now, perhaps the most debated aspect of Paul's thinking has been this question. What did Paul think was the relationship between first century Judaism and the new Jesus movement? Now, we Protestants have, I will say it, suffered for 500 years from Martin Luther's view of Paul here in first century Judaism. Martin Luther taught that first century Judaism was teaching, Second Temple Judaism was teaching in the first century, salvation by works. Therefore, Luther said, Paul was rejecting Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of his day, and starting a whole new religion called Christianity that had nothing to do, essentially, with the Judaism of the first century. And Luther went on, Jewish law Paul made very clear that Jewish law has no role in the Christian life. And grace and faith are therefore opposed to Jewish law and its emphasis on works. Now, as you might have guessed, Martin Luther was a supersessionist. Now, a supersessionist means a replacement theologian. The key word here is supersede, which means to go beyond and replace. And supersessionism, replacement theology, has two parts. First, the people, and second, the land. So Luther taught that the Jewish people, since the resurrection of Christ, 30 AD, most historians think that since 30 AD, the Jewish people, for God, are no longer the chosen people. That's the first part of supersessionism, the people, and the second part is the land. Luther went on to say, therefore, the land of Israel is no longer holy. So those are the two parts of supersessionism or replacement theology, the people and the land. Now, since the 1970s and 1980s, a scholarly movement called the New Perspective on Paul, led by James Dunn and E.P. Sanders and N.T. Wright, the British and Anglican theologian with whom he's a friend, but I disagree with him. They have challenged Martin Luther's view of Paul. The new perspective on Paul, these scholars have said that Second Temple Judaism, the Judaism of Paul's day, did not teach salvation by works. They have said, and I think rightly, that Luther was imposing upon Paul in the first century his own 16th century battle against Roman Catholic semi-Pelagian teaching. Now, what's semi-Pelagian? Basically, if we try hard enough, God will look at our trying hard and save us. That Luther was imposing his own 16th century battle against Roman Catholic semi-Pelagians on Paul's battles with what Paul called Judaizers. And in reality, first century Judaism was not teaching salvation by works, but rather what the new perspective on Paul calls covenantal nomism. Now covenantal, obviously the key word there is covenant. Nomism comes from the Greek word for law, nomos. So covenantal following of the law, which means, now this again is the new perspective on Paul. The Jews are actually saved by grace, but they have to stay in the covenant by obedience to the terms of the covenant if they want to stay in the covenant. Saved by grace. Why? Through circumcision. At 8 days old, they take this little baby boy and they cut off a part of his body. And they say, despite the fact that this baby boy knows nothing, has done nothing, he, through this, I would say, sacrament of circumcision, is lifted up out of linear time and put into what I would call Jewish sacramental time, where he now becomes a child of the covenant, a Ben Brit. He's a member of the family of Abraham. This is a miracle. A cosmic miracle takes place on this little boy who has done nothing. He has done no works to earn it. That's salvation by grace. Much like a certain rabbi of the first century taught in John 15:10, you will remain in my love. So he's saved by grace, but now in first century Judaism, the rabbis say to this little boy, you have to remain in the covenant by keeping the terms of the covenant, by obeying the commandments, the 613 commandments of the covenant. Much like a certain rabbi in the first century who is recorded in John 15 to have said, you will remain in my love if you keep my commandments. No cheap grace there. No cheap love. Love, as they say in the American South. Love. So, and the new perspective on Paul goes on to say that Paul, therefore, had no problem with Jewish law, contrary to what Martin Luther taught. Romans 3:31, Paul says, and by the way, you know that Romans is Paul's longest letter. It's his most mature reflection on Jews and Gentiles and grace and law. In Romans 3:31, he asks a question, do we then overthrow the law, Torah, by this faith? Me genoito, he says. That's Greek for no way, Jose. On the contrary, we uphold the law, Torah. We uphold Torah. Then in Romans 7, verse 12, the law, Torah, is holy, and the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Verse 14, the law is spiritual. Verse 16, I agree with the law that it is good. Verse 22, I delight in the law of God in my inner being. Verse 25, I serve the law of God with my mind. And then chapter 8, verses 3 and 4. Now, this is Romans 8. God has done what Torah cannot do. He sent his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh to condemn sin in the flesh in order that the righteous requirement of the law, Torah, might be fulfilled in us who walk according to the Spirit. Now, the latest version of the New Perspective on Paul is saying, and they've been saying this for about 20 years now, that although Paul does not reject Jewish law, therefore he did not reject that dimension of Second Temple Judaism. Nevertheless, he did reject Second Temple Judaism because it was supposedly, according to the New Perspective, too ethnic and racial. So as N.T. Wright puts it, Paul rejected the Judaism of his days, teaching because he believed in grace, not race. And Second Temple Judaism was teaching race. Now, these days, that word race is a fraught word, isn't it? And despite the fact that anthropologists and biologists both disciplines agree, that there's no really such thing as race. But nevertheless, sociologically, these days, in our cultures in the global north at least, it has enormous power, especially in politics, and it is equated with skin color. So the New Perspective now on Paul, these scholars are saying that Paul rejected, they're suggesting that Paul rejected Second Temple Judaism because Second Temple Judaism was too concerned with race. Critics, and you're looking at one of them here, say, Paul would not recognize this concept of race. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5, from now on, we recognize no man according to the flesh. So some of us say the New Perspective on Paul with this grace, not race business is imposing wokeism on the Apostle Paul and Second Temple Judaism. Second Temple Judaism was not woke. Now, there's a brand new book out on Paul and Israel, and it's sucking all the oxygen out of the room of Pauline studies. And the author is Jason Staples. He's a professor of Scripture at North Carolina State in the United States. And this book was published last year by Cambridge University Press. And everybody's talking about it, and everyone's buying it. I find out all my scholar friends who do Paul and who just do theology in general, and many, many, many pastors are buying this book, and it sounds so good. So listen to the title and the subtitle and tell me if it sounds great to you. Paul and the Resurrection of Israel, Jews, former Gentiles, and Israelites. Now, doesn't that sound great? Sounds like it would fit right here in this room, doesn't it? Don't be fooled. Now I'm going to skip 2 sections here because of time, and I'm going to continue talking about these things in a lecture on Saturday night at 7 o'clock, sponsored by Jerusalem Seminary, being held at the Notre Dame Center. And the title of the lecture is Israel's Restoration in the New Heavens and the New Earth. So I'll talk more about these things there. But I'm going to, because of time, I'm going to skip these next 2 sections. Whoever is doing the screens there, I'm skipping the section called No Faith Alone, and I'm skipping the section called Protestant Views of God's Sovereignty have read an arbitrariness into Romans 9 that is not there, making God a monstrous tyrant. So I'm skipping those sections. I might talk more about them on Saturday night. So the title of Staples' book, Jason Staples is the author, Paul and the Resurrection of Israel. Sounds great, doesn't it? It's a Trojan horse, folks. It's a new supersessionism in disguise. It's a new replacement theology in disguise. Because his thesis is that the only Israel that God cares about today is that of Jesus' followers. God doesn't care anymore, and in fact doesn't even consider them Israelites, Jews who don't follow Jesus. So the only true Israelites today are what we would call Gentile Jesus followers, most of us here, and Jewish Jesus followers. They're the only they are the only Israelites. Now, you notice I'm stuttering here. I wrote a book called Famous Stutterers, 12 famous stutterers from Moses to Marilyn Monroe. So look it up at Amazon. And if you really want to learn how to stutter, I can teach you afterwards. So he says only Jesus followers are true Israelites. And in fact, Gentile Christians, which are probably most of us here this morning, are the only true Israelites. And in fact, not only that, but it gets worse. Gentile Christians are former Gentiles. They're no longer Gentiles. So if you're a Gentile and you're a Jesus follower, you are no longer a Gentile. You're a former Gentile, and he translates 1 Corinthians 22 to say that. He says that he quotes 1 Corinthians 12:2 that way as former Gentiles. Now, the ESV, that's the English Standard version, it's not the best, but it'll do for us. Goes like this for 1 Corinthians 12:2. When you were pagans, you were led astray to mute idols. Now, the word former that Staples puts into his translation of 1 Corinthians 12:2 is not in the Greek. It's inserted by Staples, and yet he reverts to this lone verse and his idiosyncratic translation over and over and over throughout his book. So Staples claims, he goes on to say, and see if this makes sense to you, that the New Testament never calls Jews never labels them as Israelites. Jews in the New Testament, he says, are never Israelites. That's funny, because when I go to Matthew 27, I see that Matthew says the Romans put a sign over Jesus' head on the cross saying, "This is Jesus, ho basileus ton Judaion, King of the Jews." Now these people are called, these first century residents of Israel, of Judea, are called Jews. And then Matthew narrates what the chief priests and scribes said of him. He is the King of Israel, Basileus Israel. Let him come down now. So Matthew thus refers to the Jews of Judea, most of whom did not follow Jesus, although they loved Jesus in the Gospels, despite what many scholars say. Matthew refers to these Jews of Judea as both Jews and members of Israel. Now, Paul does the same thing in Romans. In Romans 9:6, when referring to the Jews of his day, he distinguishes those who are from Israel and those who are Israel. So ex-Israel and hutoi Israel. Now, those who are Israel are evidently Messianic Jews. the children of the promise, as he calls them in chapter 9, verse 8, who are the remnant, as he calls them in chapter 9, verse 27 and 11:5, who accept Jesus as Messiah. So they are the called in 9:24 from the Jews, right alongside those who are called from the Gentiles. So Paul here refers to Jewish believers both as Israel and as Jews. But Staples claims that Paul never calls Jews Israelites, despite lots of evidence that he does. And Staples insists, therefore, that there's no continuing covenant with non-Messianic Jews. So Jews who deny Jesus are no longer the chosen people. They're no longer Israelites. And by implication, the land promise is defunct, since it was made with Jews who are not Israelites now. So the land promise is no longer. Now, I want to tell you, as someone who's been reading the Greek New Testament since I was in high school, which was about 100 years ago, I went to a Jesuit high school in New York City, and I took classical Greek, Homeric Greek, because it was a dead language and I wouldn't have to speak it because I was a terrible stutterer. And then through the Catholic Charismatic movement, when I was at the University of Chicago, I discovered, whoa, the New Testament is written in Greek. And I go to the New Testament, especially the Gospel of John, the letters of John. It's like baby talk compared to Homer and Plato. So, but I should confess my sins. I was a supersessionist until about 25 years ago, and I had a wake-up call. And part of the wake-up call was seeing Romans 11, 28 and 29. And what I realized in Romans 11, 28 and 29 is Paul here is talking expressly, specifically about Jews, his brother Jews, his brothers and his sisters, who had not accepted Jesus yet. And he says in verse 28, they used to be beloved, but now that they haven't accepted Jesus, they're no longer beloved. No, he doesn't say that. He says they are beloved, present tense, because of the fathers, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So they are still beloved. These Jews who had not seen the beauty of Jesus yet. Nevertheless, they're still beloved because of the fathers. Then, yes. So that suggests that God's eternal covenant, as Peter said yesterday in Jeremiah 31, verses 35 and 36, Paul says, or Jeremiah says, that as long as the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky, the Jewish people will always be a nation, a goy before me. And as Peter said, just as was true yesterday, I'm pretty sure it's true today too, that the sun, moon, and stars are still in the sky. Although we can't see them all the time, and especially today with these clouds rolling in, but they're still there. So then in verse 29, the very next verse, Paul says, the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, will never be revoked. Now, let's take the second word there, calling, klesis. That's a technical term for God calling the Jewish people to be his chosen people. And he says, this will never be revoked. The Jewish people will always be my chosen people. Now, Paul is referring to, among other places in the Hebrew Bible, certainly Exodus 4:22, where Moses tells Pharaoh that Israel is God's firstborn son. And he goes on to teach, God does, through Moses, through Torah, that God has called the people of Israel to be a priestly nation before him. the whole nation is to serve as a priest. Now, what does it mean to serve as a priest? Now I'm an Anglican priest. I don't expect you to understand that or accept it, but the calling of a priest is to show the world who the true God is. A priest as a person and a priestly nation shows the whole world and says, the true God is the God of Israel, who has a Messiah, and it's not, the true God is not that God. It's not that God. It's not that God. It's not Allah, but it's the God of Israel. That's what God raised up the whole Jewish people to be a whole nation as a collective priest to point to the world who the true God is. And we as Gentiles are grafted in to join in that priesthood. So we too are to join the nation of Israel and say, the true God is the God of Israel. The God of Israel. Now, Paul also says in verse 29, the gifts of God are irrevocable. Now, what are the gifts of God? Well, Paul lists a whole bunch of gifts in Romans 9. But when you look at what the Jewish theological and intellectual leaders in the first century were saying about the gifts of God, at Philo, for instance, the great Jewish philosopher who was a contemporary of Paul, at Josephus, the great Jewish historian, at Ezekiel, the tragedian, the playwright, these three great Jewish intellectuals of the first century, they talked about the gifts of God. And for every single one of them, the number one gift of God is the land. And Paul implicitly is saying here that the gift of the land is still in place. And Paul is right, this is Romans. And he's probably writing Romans about 57 AD. So about 7 years before his head gets cut off by Nero, as far as we know. So toward the end of life, of his life, more than 25 years after his conversion, he still believes in the land promise. Now, some of my supersessionist scholar friends say, "Oh, Jerry, are you really sure that Paul?" And I was told in graduate school at the University of Iowa, where I did my PhD, and at the University of Chicago, where I did a bachelor's in New Testament and early Christian literature, I was told by all my professors and almost all the scholarship I read that the land promise is no longer in the New Testament. It dropped out because Paul is doing this new thing called Christianity that has nothing to do with Second Temple Judaism. There is no land promise anymore. And I'll never forget the day when I had read this passage in Acts 13 for probably 25, I'm afraid to say, years without seeing it. And all of a sudden, it jumped off the page of me. Acts 13, verses 19 through 21. Paul is preaching in a synagogue in Antioch of Pisidia, and what is now Turkey. And probably some of you have been there to Antioch of Pisidia. And he says, starting in verse 19, the God of this people, Israel, chose our fathers. Now there's our fathers again, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the same term that's used in Romans 11. Chose our fathers and made the people great during their stay in the land of Egypt. And with uplifted arm, he led them out of it. And for about 40 years, he put up with them in the wilderness. And after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan. Now, what's he referring to there? The conquest that's described in the book of Joshua. That most of my scholar friends, a lot of my pastor friends, find that to be the most difficult book in the Bible to defend. Genocide, they say. God ordered genocide of those 7 pagan nations. Paul doesn't seem to be embarrassed one bit. He's not ashamed of it. He doesn't think of it as genocide. after destroying 7 nations in the land of Canaan, he gave them their land as an inheritance. I remember about 25 years ago, I saw that. I go, whoa, there it is. But all my professors told me it wasn't there. And you know what? When you're told something is not there, you tend not to see it. Now, my wife has a great eye for dirt. And I tend not to see the dirt that she sees. But it's a lot worse than that. It's a lot worse than that. There it is. And Mojmir mentioned the first, I've done 4 books on theology of Israel, and my first was a collection of essays that came out of a conference at Georgetown University back in 2015 that became the book, The New Christian Zionism. And if you get that book, and if you read that book, you will see that the land promise, the New Christian Zionism, the land promise is all over the New Testament in every single book. Every single book. But if you're told it's not there, you tend not to see it. So in conclusion, Paul was not a supersessionist. He is not a supersessionist. He is among the great ones in heaven today, the great cloud of witnesses. And I dare to say, today, he is not a supersessionist. He is not a replacement theologian. He still believes in the land promise, as he teaches very clearly in the New Testament. He believed the Jewish people are still the chosen people, and the land is still the Holy Land. Now, I do have to close with this note. The Nazi Party distributed thousands, probably tens of thousands of copies of Luther's late essay toward the end of his life called On the Jews and Their Lies, to persuade German Christians that Paul had turned against the Jews, just as Staples' book says, and had turned against their covenant, just as Staples' book says, and that the land promise is no longer in effect, and the Jews are no longer God's chosen people. And that book was very effective in getting the Lutherans in the north, Germany was more Catholic in the south and Lutheran in the north, to accept the anti-Jewish laws that started shortly after he was elected by a plurality, after Hitler was elected by a plurality in 1933. Staples' book, tragically, is repeating a very similar, now I'm not saying he's a Hitler and he doesn't intend that, but the book, and it's the runaway bestseller book now, folks, in Pauline Studies. Cambridge University Press has published it last year. Staples' book is tragically repeating this misrepresentation of Paul. So, folks, friends, brothers and sisters, Jews are once more on the run, and Gentile Christians are tragically joining the chase, partly because they believe these misrepresentations of Paul. Let us not support a discredited Pauline theology that once again threatens to shame the church in its treatment of Jews and their God-given covenant. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Join us again next Thursday at 3 p.m. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on our social media platforms for more exclusive ICEJ content.
Hey there!
You might be wondering why you might not see our posts as often as you did before. Well, Meta is suppressing the reach and visibility of our content just for standing with Israel.
The mainstream media won't report the truth. And yes, the enemy wants to silence us.
But as the church, we are called to stand out and speak out boldly, fearlessly.
That's why we need you. Like and share our posts. Every like, comment, and share breaks the silence. And join our ICEJ Telegram group today for first release content from Jerusalem, community member exclusive competitions, and more. Go to t.me/ICEJ official or scan the QR code at the end of this video.
The truth cannot be silenced. Let's keep the truth alive together.
Join and engage.